The ribbon was already in his hand when Celia Archer set her pencil down and drew a single, deliberate line through Marcus Wells's name. The crowd around the judging table at the Harding County Fair had gone utterly silent. Not the comfortable silence of a summer afternoon where grasshoppers sang in the dry grass and children chased each other between the livestock pens. This was the silence of held breath, of 200 pairs of eyes swinging from the long table where 3 judges sat to the tall man standing 20 feet away, with a blue ribbon curling between his fingers like a question that had not yet been asked aloud. Marcus Wells had won first place at this fair for 6 consecutive years. He had won Best Hereford Bull 4 times. He had won Best Quarter Horse Breeding Stock twice. He had won the crop rotation demonstration 2 years running, and his wheat display had taken the silver cup so many times that the engraver in Amarillo knew his name without being told. He wore his victories the way a soldier wears campaign medals, not with vanity exactly, but with the certainty of a man who had paid for every one of them in sweat and sleepless nights and soil worked until his hands cracked and bled. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, sunburned to the color of saddle leather, with dark eyes that had a way of going very still when he was calculating something. He was not a man who lost, and Celia Archer, the newly appointed 3rd judge of the Harding County Agricultural Fair of 1883, had just decided that this year he would. The head judge, old Reginald Pratt, cleared his throat and leaned sideways to look at Celia's score sheet. His white eyebrows climbed toward the brim of his hat. He said nothing. The 2nd judge, a stout hardware merchant named Dolan, stared at her as if she had announced she intended to fly. Marcus Wells crossed the distance between himself and the judging table in 8 measured strides. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply walked toward Celia with that stillness in his eyes turned into something considerably sharper, and when he reached the edge of the table he set the blue ribbon down with a soft, final sound, as if he were placing a card in a game he expected to win. "I'd like to know," he said quietly. "Why?" Celia looked up at him. She was 27 years old, new to Harding County, new to Texas entirely, having traveled out from Cincinnati 3 months prior to take the position of county agricultural assessor, a job nobody had expected a woman to fill, and which she had gotten over the protests of half the town council by presenting 14 letters of reference, a degree in agricultural science from the Ohio State School of Agriculture, and a composure so unshakable it had apparently frightened the remaining half of the council into agreement. She had dark gold hair pinned under a practical felt hat, and her eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the sky turns just before a serious storm rolls in across the plains. She was not beautiful in the way that men in 1883 generally discussed beauty, meaning she was not soft or decorative or inclined to smile reassuringly at men who were irritated with her. She was striking, she was precise, and she was, at this particular moment, entirely calm. "Your bull," she said. Marcus blinked, just once. "What about my bull?" "The left foreleg. There's a stress fracture beginning in the lower cannon bone. I saw it in the way he shifted his weight during the presentation." "Your display is magnificent, Mr. Wells. Your records are impeccable. And under ordinary circumstances, your Hereford operation is the finest in this county. But you presented an animal with a developing injury as a breeding prize specimen, and I cannot in good conscience award a blue ribbon to an animal that is going to be lame within 6 months if that fracture is not treated." The silence stretched. A child somewhere near the pie display began to cry and was immediately hushed. Marcus Wells looked at Celia Archer for a long, suspended moment. She looked back. "You're wrong," he said. "I'm not," she said, and that was where it truly began. 3 months earlier, Celia had arrived in Harding County on the southbound stage from Abilene, carrying 2 leather trunks, a crate of agricultural textbooks, and the specific brand of quiet confidence that comes from having spent one's entire adult life being told that one's ambitions were inappropriate, impractical, or simply impossible. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the daughter of a livestock auctioneer who had taken her everywhere with him, because her mother had died when Celia was 8, and he did not know what else to do with a determined little girl who could already read a bill of sale faster than most of his adult employees. She had learned to assess animals before she learned to properly bake bread. She had learned soil composition before she learned to sow. By the time she was 16, she could walk a field of wheat and tell a farmer within 10 bushels per acre what his harvest would yield. And her father, a practical man who valued accuracy above almost everything else, had looked at her one evening over a cold supper and said, "You ought to go to school for this, Celia. The real kind." The real kind had been difficult. The Ohio State School of Agriculture had admitted women since 1870, but it had not made the experience particularly comfortable, and Celia had spent 4 years being the only woman in classrooms where professors sometimes forgot she was present, and fellow students sometimes remembered her existence with the specific cruelty of young men who felt threatened by capability. She had graduated second in her class, which her closest friend Margaret said was remarkable, and which Celia privately believed should have been first if the final evaluator had not been a man who simply could not bring himself to place a woman's name above a man's on a formal document. She had worked for 2 years assessing livestock operations for a Cincinnati trading company before she saw the advertisement placed by Harding County, Texas, seeking an agricultural assessor. The pay was better than what she earned in Ohio. The position carried genuine authority, and she had looked out her office window at the gray Ohio winter and thought that she was 27 years old and had not yet done anything that truly frightened her, which seemed like an oversight. Texas frightened her appropriately. The town of Harding was not large. It had a main street, a courthouse, 3 saloons, 2 churches that regarded each other with deep suspicion, a mercantile, a feed and grain operation, a livery stable, a hotel called the Frontier House that was somewhat cleaner than it sounds, and approximately 800 residents within the town limits, with several thousand more scattered across the surrounding ranches and farms that made up the county. It was dusty and sun-baked, and the wind blew constantly from the southwest, carrying the smell of cattle and dry grass, and in the evenings the sky turned colors that Celia had never seen over Ohio, deep orange fading into violet, with a few enormous stars appearing before the light was fully gone, hanging low and bright the way stars never hung in the east. She took her position seriously. In her first 3 months she visited 42 ranches and farms across the county, assessing livestock operations, crop management, water rights documentation, and land improvement plans. She kept meticulous records. She was polite. She was thorough. She made recommendations that some farmers found useful and which others found intrusive, depending on their temperament and the condition of their operations. She heard about Marcus Wells within her first week. He came up in conversation the way a geographical landmark does, not as gossip exactly, but as orientation. You understand the county, people seem to suggest, when you understand Marcus Wells. His ranch, the Creosote Wells property 14 miles southeast of town, was 3,000 acres of Hereford cattle and wheat fields, and a horse breeding operation that had made him, at 32, one of the wealthiest men in the county. He had built most of it himself, having inherited a modest 200 acres from his father and expanded outward through a combination of hard work, shrewd land purchases, and an eye for livestock quality that people described with the particular reverence usually reserved for natural gifts. "He's not easy," said Mrs. Fontaine at the dry goods store, wrapping Celia's first order of supplies in brown paper. "He's proud. He's fair, I'll give him that, fairer than most men out here. But he doesn't suffer fools, and he doesn't much like being questioned." "I question everything," Celia said pleasantly. Mrs. Fontaine looked at her over her spectacles. "Yes," she said. "I can see that's going to be interesting." Celia visited Creosote Wells Ranch on a Tuesday in July, 3 weeks before the fair. She drove herself out in the county assessment buggy, which was a practical arrangement that she preferred to accepting rides from men who then felt they had done her a favor and could therefore be more familiar than was professionally appropriate. The ranch was everything its reputation promised. The main house was solid and well-maintained, built from limestone and timber, with a deep porch running along the front and a kitchen garden along the south side that someone tended with genuine care. The outbuildings were in excellent repair. The fences were tight. The cattle she could see from the approach road were in outstanding condition, well-fed and healthy, with the deep chest and solid hindquarters that good Hereford genetics produced. A man was working in the corral near the barn when she drove in, and she recognized from the description that it was Marcus Wells himself, working with a 2-year-old filly that was giving him considerable argument about accepting a saddle. He finished what he was doing, settling the horse with a patient steadiness that impressed her, before he came to the fence rail and acknowledged her arrival. He was taller than she had expected, leaned through the shoulders in the way that comes from work rather than idleness, with dark hair pushed under a battered hat and a 2-day beard that suggested time was a resource he allocated elsewhere. His eyes, when he looked at her, were exactly as described, very still, very dark, and currently very assessing. "Miss Archer," he said. Not a question, not particularly a welcome. "Mr. Wells," she said, climbing down from the buggy without waiting for assistance, which she registered caused a slight shift in his expression, not offense exactly, more a recalibration. "I appreciate you accommodating the assessment visit. I'll need to see your breeding records, your herd health documentation, and I'd like to walk the south pasture if you have no objection." He studied her for another moment. "You've been busy," he said. 42 operations in 3 months. 41 completed assessments," she said. "Yours is the 42nd. Something in his expression shifted again, and she realized with a slight surprise that it was amusement. "You counted." "I count everything," she said. "It's my job." He showed her everything she asked to see without complaint, which she had not entirely expected. His records were the best she had encountered in the county, organized, detailed, going back 7 years, with breeding lines documented, and health outcomes tracked in a way that suggested genuine understanding rather than mere compliance with record-keeping requirements. His wheat operation showed a sophisticated rotation system that she recognized from current agricultural literature, and which she had not seen implemented this well anywhere else in her assessment territory. He was intelligent. That was the thing that caught her somewhat off guard. She had met many skilled ranchers who operated on inherited knowledge and practical instinct, and she had met a few who read and thought and experimented deliberately. Marcus Wells was the latter kind, and she found that the conversation that developed as they walked his south pasture was the most genuinely interesting professional conversation she had had since arriving in Harding County. He asked her questions about soil nitrogen management that were not simple questions. She answered them with specifics drawn from papers published the previous year by the Agricultural College at Cornell. He knew one of the papers she referenced. They argued about a point in it for approximately 10 minutes while his cattle grazed around them with complete indifference, and when she ultimately produced the specific citation to settle the disagreement, he conceded it with a directness she found refreshing. "You know your business," he said, which in the register of Marcus Wells appeared to be a significant compliment. "I do," she said. He did not offer to shake her hand when she left, because in 1883 Texas that was not what men did with women, but he walked her back to her buggy and held the horse's head while she climbed in and said, "If you want to see the Hereford bull operation, you'll need to come back. He's out on the north pasture today. I'll schedule a follow-up," she said. She drove back toward town thinking about the way he had moved around his animals, with that same quality of stillness she had noticed in his eyes, as if he communicated some assurance through proximity alone that made nervous horses and stubborn cattle settle. It was a particular gift, and she had grown up around enough livestock operations to recognize it as rare. She came back 2 days later for the follow-up assessment, and the bull was precisely as magnificent as his reputation. Red King III was his name, a full-grown Hereford of exceptional build and temperament, with a pedigree that Marcus could recite from memory and health records that were beyond reproach. Celia walked around the animal with her notebook, recording her observations, and she would have scored him at the top of her scale without hesitation except for one thing. It was subtle. She almost missed it, and she would not have caught it at all if she had not spent 18 months of her first employment assessing livestock for a Cincinnati trading company whose founder had told her, on her first day, that the animal tells you what it knows if you are quiet enough to let it speak. Red King III was standing with a fractional preference on his right foreleg. Not a limp, not even something that most observers would register as unusual. Just a degree or two of shifted weight, repeated consistently over the 20 minutes she observed him moving around the enclosure in a pattern that was not random. She noted it. She noted the specific leg, the specific location she estimated based on the movement pattern, the consistency of the behavior, and her assessment that this was early stage rather than advanced injury. She wrote in her assessment, developmental stress fracture, lower cannon bone, left foreleg, requires veterinary confirmation. Animal should not be presented as prime breeding stock until cleared. She had not told Marcus Wells about this finding when she left. She had intended to, and then she had looked at the end of the assessment afternoon. He had been called away to deal with a fence situation on the east boundary, and she had left her completed paperwork with his foreman, as was standard procedure. She had told herself she would write him a letter. She had drafted the letter twice, and found that the language required to convey what she needed to convey without sounding either apologetic or aggressive was more difficult to construct in writing than it would have been in person. She had still not sent it when the fair opened. She had arrived at the judging table at the Harding County Fair carrying her finding in her conscience like a stone in her boot, knowing that the moment she exercised her authority as judge it was going to cause exactly the kind of scene that was now unfolding around her. "You're wrong," Marcus Wells had said. "I'm not," she had said. And now he was looking at her across the table with those very still, very dark eyes, and she could see the anger in him. Not hot anger, not the kind that shouted and made a spectacle, but the cold, controlled kind that in her experience was considerably more dangerous because it lasted longer. "Red King," he said, "is in perfect health. Dr. Waverly examined him a month ago." "A month is a long time," Celia said, "and Dr. Waverly is a good veterinarian, but the fracture I observed would have been in its earliest stages. I saw the weight-shifting pattern in 2 separate visits. It's consistent and it's progressive." "You saw," he said. "I observed," she corrected, carefully, over 20 minutes each time. Reginald Pratt had risen from his chair and was now standing between them with the specific energy of a man who had been running the Harding County Fair for 19 years and was not prepared for this development. "Now see here," he said, which was not a particularly useful contribution but seemed to make him feel better. Marcus Wells did not look at Reginald Pratt, he looked at Celia. "Where exactly," he said, "do you say the fracture is?" "Lower cannon bone, left foreleg." His jaw tightened, the smallest motion, but she was watching for it. "I'll have Dr. Waverly look at him again today." "That would be appropriate," Celia said. "And if you're wrong," Marcus said, "I'd like to know what exactly happens to the assessment and the judging decision." "If I'm wrong," Celia said, "you will have the apology of every judge at this table and the record will be corrected. If I'm right, Mr. Wells, you will have the information you need to treat your animal before a developing injury becomes a crippling one." Something crossed his face at that. A fraction of something that was not exactly anger and not quite acknowledgement and was considerably more complicated than either. He picked up the ribbon from the table. He folded it once precisely. He put it in his coat pocket. "I'll be back," he said, and walked away. He was back in 2 hours. The fair continued around the table. Pies were judged, preserved goods were assessed. Children competed in events involving potato sacks and their own determination. And Celia sat at the table and did her work, and did not allow herself to watch the entrance to the livestock barn, where she knew Marcus Wells had taken Red King to Dr. Waverley's temporary examination station. Dr. Samuel Waverley was a veterinarian of genuine competence who had come to Harding County 6 years prior and had, by Celia's estimation from a brief professional conversation, a solid practical foundation and a decent instinct for diagnosis. She respected him. She also believed that in the early examination a month ago he had not specifically looked for what she had found, because she had been looking for it and he had been conducting a general wellness assessment. She was right about Red King. She knew she was right. She had been right about livestock diagnoses for 10 years, and she knew the difference between certainty and optimism, and this was certainty. But sitting at that table in the Texas August heat, with 200 county residents watching her from various angles, and the knowledge that her professional standing in this community was 3 months old and fragile, she found that certainty felt considerably lonelier than it did in the abstract. When Marcus Wells came back across the fairground toward the judging table, she could read the verdict in the way he moved before he opened his mouth. He walked to the table and he stood in front of her and he said nothing for a full 3 seconds, which she thought was probably how long it took him to construct a sentence that was truthful and did not cost him more than he was willing to pay in a public setting. "You were right," he said. She exhaled. It came out steadier than she felt. "I'm sorry about Red King," she said, and meant it entirely. "Dr. Waverley says it's caught early enough. Treatment is possible." He paused. "He wants to know how you diagnosed it from observation." The weight-shifting pattern, left foreleg, repeated consistently. Animals protect an injury even when it's too early to produce a visible gait change. He looked at her for another of those suspended moments. The crowd, she was aware, was watching with intense interest. She kept her eyes on his. "Miss Archer," he said, and there was something in his voice that had shifted, not the anger, not the pride, but something underneath both of them that was more honest and harder to look at directly. "I owe you an apology." "You owe me nothing," she said. "You owe Red King a veterinarian and 4 to 6 months of proper treatment." "I meant for doubting your judgment publicly." "You had reason to doubt it," she said. "You didn't know me. That's not an unreasonable position." He picked up the blue ribbon from where he had set it back on the table after removing it from his pocket. He set it down in front of the second-place ribbon that had been awarded to Bill Cranston's Hereford operation, which was excellent, simply not Marcus Wells's usual standard. He straightened it with one finger. "Second place is where I belong this year," he said, and she heard in it the particular quality of a man who had accepted a loss that was genuinely fair and was making his peace with it. "My bull shouldn't have been entered." "Your wheat display won first in its category," Celia said, legitimately and without question. His mouth moved toward something that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same region of his expression. "Small comfort," he said. "Better than a blue ribbon you hadn't earned," she said. He looked at her one more time with those very still dark eyes that she was beginning to understand operated as a kind of internal gauge, measuring, assessing, filing away. Then he nodded once and walked away. Mrs. Fontaine found Celia afterward by the lemonade stand, which was doing strong business in the August heat. "Well," said Mrs. Fontaine, handing her a glass with the air of someone who had witnessed a historical event. "I've been watching Marcus Wells at this fair since he was 17 years old, and I have never once in my life seen him concede anything to anyone in public." "He conceded to the evidence," Celia said, "not to me." "In this county," Mrs. Fontaine said, "the difference between those two things is smaller than you might think." The following week was quiet. Celia did her work. She drove out to 3 new assessment properties and wrote her reports. She took her meals at the Frontier House and read in the evenings, and did not think about Marcus Wells more than was professionally appropriate. She thought about him considerably more than was professionally appropriate. It was the way he had accepted the correction. She had expected anger, sustained, private anger of the kind that would manifest as obstacles in her work, as coldness, as the specific variety of male resentment that she had encountered before when her professional judgment inconvenienced important men. She had not expected what she had gotten instead, which was acknowledgment that was clean and complete and entirely without excuse-making. She had also not expected to think about his hands, which was an entirely unprofessional line of thought that she dealt with by returning to her agricultural reports with extra vigor. Marcus Wells appeared at her office on a Thursday morning 10 days after the fair. Her office was a small room above the county clerk's office, reached by an exterior staircase, and she heard his boots on the wooden stairs before she looked up and saw him in the doorway. "Mr. Wells," she said. "I'd like to hire you," he said without preamble. She set down her pen. "As what?" "As a consultant for the bull operation. Red King's going to need careful management over the next 6 months, and Dr. Waverly is capable, but he doesn't have your observational methodology. I'd like someone who can assess the operation monthly and catch anything that develops before it becomes a crisis." She considered this. It was a legitimate professional request. It was also the kind of arrangement that, in a town this size, would generate conversation. She was aware of this without being particularly concerned about it. She was more concerned with whether it was appropriate for her, as county assessor, to take private consulting work, a question she had not previously encountered because no one had previously asked. "I'd need to check whether the county position permits private consulting arrangements," she said. "The county charter permits it with disclosure. I checked before I came here." She looked at him. "You researched the county charter." "Before I asked," he said. Like the right order of things. She picked up her pen and put it down again, which was not a decision, merely a habit. "The hourly rate for agricultural consulting in this region is $2, she said. "3, he said. "I said 2, Mr. Wells. "Your diagnostic capacity is worth 3. I'm not interested in negotiating down from an accurate number." She thought that this was perhaps one of the more interesting things a client had ever said to her in the course of professional negotiation. 2.5, she said, which was not a concession to sentiment but rather a number she could professionally justify. 2.5, he agreed. She wrote the agreement. He signed it. Their hands did not touch in the process because she set the pen on the desk for him to pick up, and he set it back when he was finished, and she picked it up after. The distance between their hands during this transaction was approximately 3 inches. She noticed this. The consulting visits began the following week. She drove out to Creosote Wells Ranch every Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours walking the cattle operation, checking on Red King's treatment progress, reviewing records and making observations. Marcus was present for each visit, which was not strictly necessary. His foreman Jonas could have answered her questions adequately, but which she told herself was simply the behavior of a rancher who took his operation seriously. They were professional with each other. They discussed bone healing rates and treatment protocols and the specific requirements of managing a prize bull through a stress fracture recovery. They discussed his winter wheat planning and the rotation schedule he intended for the East Field. They had arguments about a number of things, because they were both the kind of people who had opinions they had arrived at through evidence and experience, and were not inclined to surrender without a matching standard of evidence from the other side. One Tuesday in September, he had brought out a newspaper from Austin with an article about a new bovine disease management protocol, and she had read it while standing in the barn with the smell of hay and horses around her, and the sound of the cattle moving in the south pasture. And she had looked up to find him watching her read with an expression that she did not immediately categorize, because it disappeared when she met his eyes. "The protocol has a flaw," she said. "I know," he said. "Which one do you see?" "The quarantine timing assumes the incubation period is fixed. It isn't. Environmental temperature affects it. They'll correct that in the next version," he said. "It's a first publication." "First publications should be more careful," she said. They'd never publish anything if they waited for perfection, he said. She looked back at the paper. No, she agreed. I suppose not. There was a quality to those Tuesday mornings that she could feel accumulating. The way precipitation accumulates before a weather event, small increments, barely perceptible day by day, but building towards something. She was a scientist by training and inclination, and she did not enjoy acknowledging things she could not quantify. But she was also honest with herself, which was a habit formed in childhood and unbreakable. And honest with herself, she was forced to admit that she looked forward to Tuesdays in a way she did not look forward to any other day of the professional week. She was also forced to admit with equal honesty that Marcus Wells was not what she had assumed him to be on the basis of his reputation as a proud and unyielding man. He was proud, yes. The pride was genuine and ran deep, but it was pride rooted in capability rather than ego, which was a meaningful distinction. He was exacting with himself in a way that she recognized because it mirrored her own internal standard. He was funny in a dry, quiet way that required attention to notice. He was, underneath the stillness and the self-possession, a man who cared about things very much, and the caring showed in the quality of his work. He was also, she noticed with some inconvenience, physically attractive in the specific way that competence makes a person attractive, which is the most persistent variety. She did not intend to do anything about any of this. In late September, a situation arose that complicated her intentions considerably. It began with a man named Forrest Kimball. Kimball was a land speculator from Houston who had been working the western counties for 2 years, and his method was not illegal exactly, but it occupied a region adjacent to legal that required careful attention to the distinction. He purchased distressed operations, subdivided the land, and sold parcels to Eastern buyers who were often significantly misled about the agricultural potential of what they were purchasing. He had 3 properties under negotiation in Harding County, and when Celia's assessment reports began showing up as documentation in the county land records, accurate documentation that reflected the true and sometimes unflattering condition of soil quality and water access, she became relevant to his business in a way that she had not anticipated. She first became aware of this when her office was entered one night and her files were searched. Nothing had been taken. But she had a method of arranging her papers that was consistent and specific, and when she arrived Thursday morning, she could see immediately that everything had been moved and replaced with care that fell just short of her own standard. She reported it to the county sheriff, a measured man named Tom Briggs who took the report seriously and investigated with thoroughness that turned up nothing directly actionable. She did not tell Marcus Wells about the break-in because it was not his business and she was not in the habit of reporting personal difficulties to clients. He found out anyway. Small towns transmit information like water transmits sound, efficiently and without regard for anyone's privacy preferences. He arrived at her office on a Friday, which was not Tuesday, and stood in the doorway with an expression that was carefully neutral in the way that careful neutrality masks something it is working to contain. "Celia," he said, and she noticed that it was the first time he had used her given name, and that it came out with a naturalness that suggested he had been thinking it longer than today. "If you've come about the break-in," she said, "I've already spoken to Sheriff Briggs." "Briggs is good, but he's limited in what he can do without evidence," Marcus said. "Kimball has people he pays to be quiet, and in a town this size that covers a lot of ground." She looked at him. "How do you know it's Kimball?" "Because I know every landowner in this county and I know their situations, and Kimball is the only operation currently running where your assessment reports create direct financial damage. He's been trying to push through 3 land sales that your reports undermine." He paused. "He approached me 6 months ago about buying part of the Creosote Wells East section. I turned him down. He is not a man who takes no gracefully." She set down the file she was holding. "Mr. Wells, Marcus," he said. She acknowledged this with a slight shift of her expression that was not quite a smile. "Marcus, I appreciate the concern. I've been in uncomfortable professional situations before." "Not with Kimball," he said. "He's escalated before. A county assessor in Beaumont County last year had an unfortunate accident that made it impossible for him to complete his assessment of Kimball's operation there. The man was not clumsy." The significance of this settled over Celia, with the particular weight of information she had not been seeking, but could not now unknow. She was not frightened, she was, by nature, not someone who moved easily into fear, but she was not naive, and she recalculated accordingly. "What do you suggest?" she said. "I'd like you to move your assessment records to a secondary location," he said. "Not your office, somewhere Kimball's people don't know about." "I can use the county courthouse vault," she said. "That's one option. I'd also like to suggest that you don't drive out to assessment properties alone until this situation is resolved. I'll provide someone to accompany you." "That's not necessary," she said. "Celia," he said her name the second time with slightly less neutral and slightly more direct. "You are the most capable agricultural professional in this county. I will not pretend otherwise. You are also a woman alone in a part of Texas where certain men take that as permission. I am not offering to protect you because I think you are incapable of protecting yourself. I am offering because Kimball has more resources than one person should have to manage alone, and because—" He stopped. "Because," she said. He looked at her with those still dark eyes, and the thing that she had been not naming for 2 months was suddenly much harder to avoid. "Because it would matter to me," he said, "if something happened to you." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved outside, carrying the dry grass smell of Texas autumn, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a harmonica badly and with great enthusiasm. "That's a significant thing to say," she said. "I'm aware of that," he said. "We should probably discuss it," she said. "We probably should," he agreed. Neither of them moved. The office was small, and the afternoon light was coming through the single window at a long September angle that made everything look warmer than it was, and she was aware of the precise distance between them in the way that you become aware of distances when they begin to feel like decisions. "Not today," she said. She picked up the file she had set down. "Let me think." He nodded once in that way he had of accepting things. "The offer for accompaniment stands regardless." "I'll use Jonah's," she said. "Your foreman, if you're willing to send him." "He'll be here Monday morning," Marcus said. He left, and she stood at the window and watched him cross the street below and mount his horse and ride back out south toward Creosote Wells Ranch. And she told herself firmly that she was going to think about the Kimball situation first and everything else second. She thought about everything else for most of the weekend. The situation with Kimball moved faster than anyone had anticipated. Sheriff Briggs made a connection through his network to the Beaumont County incident and brought a federal land office inspector named Patterson into the investigation. Patterson arrived in Harding on a Wednesday, and Celia spent 4 hours with him going through her assessment records, which she had moved to the courthouse vault as Marcus had suggested. Kimball apparently became aware of the investigation faster than anyone had hoped, because on Thursday evening he left town with 2 of his associates and a significant quantity of documents that Patterson had very much wanted to examine. He was apprehended in Abilene 4 days later. The case that followed was a federal matter, and Celia's assessment records formed a significant part of the documentation submitted to the Federal Land Office inquiry. She gave her testimony in a formal statement, clearly and completely, and was told by Patterson that her professional records were among the most complete and well-documented he had seen in this type of investigation. The 3 land sales Kimball had been managing fell through. 2 of the properties reverted to their original owners, and 1 entered a legitimate sales process. 2 Eastern buyers who had already purchased land based on Kimball's misrepresentations received revised assessments from Celia showing the true conditions, and she suspected that legal proceedings would follow in due course. It was over in a practical sense, though the paperwork would continue for months. On the Sunday after Kimball's arrest became public knowledge, Marcus Wells rode into town, tied his horse at the post outside the Frontier House, walked to the hotel dining room where Celia was eating her dinner and sat down across from her without waiting to be invited. She looked at him. He looked back. "He's in custody," she said. "I heard," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "I can see that," he said. The waiter came over with an inquiring expression and Marcus ordered coffee without looking up from Celia's face. "You said," she said, "that we should probably discuss something." "I said we should probably discuss it," he said. "You said not today. That was 3 weeks ago." "I can wait," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Outside, the October evening was cooling toward the temperature where the plains at night become genuinely beautiful, the air sharp and clean and the stars beginning. Those enormous Texas stars that she had not yet stopped being amazed by. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said, about it mattering to you. And I've been trying to determine," she said, with the precision she brought to most things, "whether what I'm experiencing is a professional admiration that resembles something else, or something else that resembles a professional admiration, because I'm careful about conflation and I don't want to be wrong." He was quiet for a moment. The coffee arrived. He wrapped both hands around the mug. "Which conclusion did you arrive at?" he said. "The latter," she said, with a confidence level higher than I'm comfortable with. His expression did something that she had not seen it do before. It warmed. It was small and it was controlled, but it was entirely genuine, and it changed his face in a way that made her feel as if she had been handed something that was not meant for general distribution. "I've been in this county for 11 years, he said. "I've known women who were kind, and women who were practical, and women who were sharp. I haven't known a woman who was all three and who also knew more about soil nitrogen than I do and wasn't afraid to tell me so." "That's a very specific qualification," she said. "I'm a specific person," he said. "Yes," she said, "you are." The evening deepened around them. The dining room emptied gradually. It was a Sunday and Harding County people rose early. They stayed for 2 hours and talked about things that were not entirely professional, which for both of them was a departure significant enough to feel like its own kind of crossing. He told her about his father, who had died when Marcus was 23, leaving the 200 acres and a mortgage that had taken 4 years to clear. He told her about the 7 years of work it had taken to build Creosote Wells to what it was now, not with self-congratulation, but with the matter-of-fact accounting of a man describing a map he had made by walking it. He told her about the drought of 1880 that had nearly ended everything, and the decisions he had made in that year that had cost him in the short term and saved him in the long term, and the sleepless months in between. She told him about Ohio, about her father and the auction houses and the cold suppers and the degree she had fought for and the job she had taken and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending 10 years being competent in spaces where you are considered a problem. She told him about the advertisement she had seen for Harding County and the window she had looked out in February, and the specific calculation she had made about being frightened as a prerequisite to anything interesting. "You came here because you were looking for something that scared you," he said. "I came here because I was looking for something that was real," she said. "I find those tend to be the same thing." He rode out of town late that evening with something different in his face than had been there in the morning, and Celia walked upstairs to her room at the Frontier House and sat at the window for a while looking at the stars. She was not accustomed to feeling things this completely. She had spent years curating a very specific kind of professional self-sufficiency that functioned as both armor and identity, and she was not certain that she had left enough space behind it for whatever this was. But Marcus Wells had the particular quality of someone who did not require space to be made for him, who simply stood in whatever space was available and was entirely present in it. And it was that quality more than anything else that made her realize the situation was more serious than she had been treating it. She picked up her notebook from the desk and opened it to a blank page and wrote, in her precise handwriting, the word terrified, and looked at it for a moment, and then wrote underneath it, good. October turned into November, and the consulting visits continued every Tuesday, and the conversation between them evolved into something richer and more layered with each week. Marcus began riding with her on assessment visits on the days she needed to cover territory near his own ranch. Not because Kimball remained a threat, which he no longer did, but because Jonas had other responsibilities, and because Marcus himself was good company on the long drives through the county roads. She learned things about him that she would not have learned in the office or in the barn. She learned that he read voraciously and had a collection of books in the ranch house library that covered everything from agricultural science to the complete works of Dickens. She learned that he had a strong sense of justice that operated quietly but functionally. She saw it in the way he dealt with the small ranchers and farmers who abutted his property, with a fairness that cost him sometimes, but that he seemed to consider simply the cost of being a neighbor. She learned that he had a temper that was rare but genuine, and that when it showed it was always on behalf of something specific and worth being angry about. He learned things about her too. He learned that she was funnier than she initially presented. Her wit was dry and specific and timed with perfect precision, and it made him laugh in a way that appeared to genuinely surprise him. He learned that she was meticulous not from anxiety but from a deep respect for accuracy, and that she held herself to a standard she did not impose on others. He learned that she was lonely in a way she had made peace with but not eliminated, the loneliness of someone who is exceptional in environments that were not built to accommodate them. On a Tuesday in late November, they had been sitting on the tailgate of the ranch wagon after a long morning in the north pasture, eating the lunch that Marcus's cook, an older Mexican woman named Senora Vargas, had packed for them, and the plains were spread out gold and enormous under the November light. And Celia had been talking about a paper she was writing for the Texas Agricultural Society about soil conservation methods, and had looked up mid-sentence to find him watching her with the same expression she had seen and not named in the barn 6 weeks ago, and this time she did not look away from it. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That you're going to be here for a long time," he said, "and that I'm glad." "You don't know that," she said. "My position is a county appointment. It can be terminated." "I know it," he said with a quietness that was not uncertainty but its opposite, "because I'm going to ask you to stay." She set down the biscuit she was holding. "You are." "Eventually," he said, "in the appropriate way and at the appropriate time, but I'm telling you now because you're the kind of person who prefers to know things in advance." She thought about this for a moment, with the large Texas sky above her and the dry grass smell of the plains and the specific internal trembling that she had been managing since that evening in the hotel dining room. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. "Since the fair," he said. "Since the fair," she repeated. "Since I didn't give you first place. Since you were right and you knew it and you didn't apologize for it," he said. "That was the moment." She looked at him for a long time. The stillness in his eyes had not changed, but it had become transparent in a way it had not been before, and she could see through it to something that was genuine and decided and quietly enormous. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a simple person to be with. I have strong opinions and I don't concede them without evidence, and I intend to continue working regardless of any personal developments." "I know that," he said. "I'm telling you it's a certainty, not a warning," she said. "I know that too," he said. She picked up the biscuit again. "Then we understand each other," she said. "We understand each other," he agreed. December arrived with the specific quiet intensity of a Texas winter, not the buried stillness of northern cold, but a leaning, brown-grassed, iron-sky quiet that made the afternoons feel like held breath. Celia continued her work. Red King III continued his treatment and progressed well, Dr. Waverly confirmed in early December that the fracture was responding to rest and management, and Celia updated her records accordingly. At the county Christmas celebration held in the Harding Courthouse on the 20th of December, Marcus Wells asked Celia Archer to dance, which in a small Texas town in 1883 was not an ambiguous gesture. She accepted, which was equally unambiguous. They danced a waltz, not gracefully, because Marcus was a competent rather than gifted dancer and Celia had limited practice, but with a steadiness that came from both of them having agreed to something beyond the music. Mrs. Fontaine watched this from across the room with an expression of deep satisfaction. The county clerk Hadley watched with cautious approval. Bill Cranston, who had won first place at the fair with his Hereford bull in Marcus's absence from first position, watched with a complicated mix of pride and confusion. "I'll be," said Reginald Pratt to no one in particular. On the first day of January, 1884, Marcus Wells drove into town in a clean coat, and with his hair properly arranged for the first time Celia had ever seen it, tied his horse at the post outside the Frontier House, walked upstairs, knocked on her office door, and when she opened it said, "I told you I would ask in the appropriate way at the appropriate time." She stood in the doorway and looked at him and felt the specific quality of a moment that is a before and an after, that divides a life cleanly into what preceded it and what follows. "You did say that," she said. "Celia Archer," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I recognize that this is an arrangement that will require us to negotiate a significant number of details, and I expect those negotiations to be thorough and occasionally contentious, and I intend them to last the rest of my life." She looked at him for a moment, and then she laughed a real laugh, unguarded and genuine, the kind she had not given publicly in longer than she could remember, and he looked startled by it, and then warmed by it in the way she had come to love best. "Yes," she said, "with the understanding that the negotiations will sometimes go in my favor." "They frequently will," he said. "You're usually right. That's an extraordinary thing for you to say." "I told you at the beginning," he said, "I'm not interested in negotiating down from an accurate number." She stepped back from the door to let him in. They set the date for March. The months between January and March were full and complicated and thoroughly alive in the way that preparation for significant things makes life feel. There were practical matters, the question of her county position, which she was determined to keep, and which she and Marcus negotiated with a completeness and good faith that she suspected was unusual. The question of where they would live, which was resolved by the obvious logic that a 3,000-acre ranch required its primary operator to reside on it, and which Celia found she was genuinely content with. The question of how her role at the ranch would be understood by the county and by Marcus's neighbors, which was resolved by Celia simply being who she was and doing her work, and allowing the results to speak with the eloquence that competence produces over time. There was also the matter of Marcus's relationship with his neighboring ranchers, several of whom had complicated feelings about the events at the fair and the subsequent consultancy arrangement, and who required the kind of patient social navigation that Marcus was not particularly inclined toward by temperament, but that Celia was, having spent a decade managing professional relationships in environments that did not particularly want her present. She handled a dinner at the ranch in February with 8 neighboring ranchers and their families, in the first real test of the creosote Wells kitchen and dining room's capacity, and Senora Vargas rose to the occasion with a magnificence that produced an evening that ended in genuine warmth and the beginning of relationships that would serve both Celia and Marcus well in the years ahead. She also went back to Ohio briefly in February to visit her father and to tell him what she was doing. He was a tall, thin, quiet man who had spent 30 years assessing livestock and who sat across from her in his Cincinnati parlor and listened to her account of Marcus Wells with the careful attention of a man evaluating something important. "Does he respect you?" he said when she was done. "Entirely," she said. "Does he understand what you are?" he said. "He does," she said. "He's the first person outside of work who has." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have liked someone who sees you properly." She held that close on the train back to Texas. They were married on a Saturday in March, 1884, in the smaller of Harding's two churches. The one with the minister who had a practical theology and did not insist on vows that required Celia to promise obedience, a detail that Marcus had quietly arranged in advance, which she did not learn about until the ceremony itself, and which she thought was among the finest things anyone had ever done for her. The wedding was attended by most of Harding County, as small-town weddings in 1883 tend to be, not all of the attendees being uniformly delighted about the development, but all of them being present, because the importance of the event to the community was undeniable. Mrs. Fontaine cried openly. Reginald Pratt shook Marcus's hand with the specific gravity of a man transmitting something. Jonas the foreman stood at the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who had been wondering for months how this would turn out and was satisfied with the answer. Celia's father had come down from Ohio for the wedding, and he and Marcus had a conversation in the hour before the ceremony that no one else heard, and that neither of them fully reported afterward, but which resulted in her father shaking Marcus's hand with both of his, and Marcus looking like a man who had passed a test he had not known he was taking, but had prepared for all his life. She walked down the aisle in a dress that was practical and beautiful simultaneously, deep blue wool, fitted, with no excessive decoration, and when she reached Marcus and looked at his face, she saw that the stillness in his eyes had given way entirely to something that was not contained or measured or held in reserve, and she understood that he was letting her see it completely, which was the thing she had been waiting for without knowing it. The vows they exchanged were honest. They were also somewhat longer than standard, because Celia had written additions, which the minister had read with faint surprise, and which the congregation had absorbed with the variety of reactions predictable in a group of 200 Texans in 1884, ranging from deeply moved to mildly scandalized to quietly impressed. Marcus had not known about the additions. His expression as he listened to them, her precise, honest accounting of what she was committing to and what she was asking for in return, was the expression of a man receiving something he had not expected and would spend the rest of his life being grateful for. "I will," he said, when the time came. He said it as if it were the most accurate statement he had ever made. They rode out to Creosote Wells Ranch that evening in the last of the winter light, Celia in her wedding dress and Marcus in his good coat, and the plains were enormous around them, and the stars were beginning to appear one by one in the deep blue Texas sky, and she sat next to him on the wagon seat with his arm around her, and felt the specific quality of arrival that she had been traveling toward for 27 years. The ranch received her the way it had from the beginning, with the solidity and the scale of something built to last. Senora Vargas had prepared the house for their arrival with flowers she had somehow procured in March in Texas, and the smell of supper cooking carried out into the cold air as they drove in, and the house was warm inside with lamplight and the sense of something that had been waiting to become itself. They settled into a life that had the particular quality of two strong, specific people making room for each other, which is not always simple, and was not always simple for them, but which produced something that was better than simple, something solid and interesting and alive. Celia continued her county assessor work. She completed her paper on soil conservation and sent it to the Texas Agricultural Society, and it was published that fall to enough attention that she was invited to address a conference in Austin the following spring, which she did, Marcus accompanying her, and sitting in the front row of the lecture hall with a stillness in his expression that she understood by now was the specific kind of pride that feels like recognition. Red King III recovered fully by summer. Dr. Waverly declared him sound in July, and he returned to the breeding operation with a health record that was now even more thoroughly documented than it had been before. At the Harding County Fair of 1884, Red King won first place in the Hereford category, by such a margin that the second-place holder took no offense, because the margin was self-evidently fair. Celia was not on the judging panel for the 1884 fair, having recused herself from the livestock categories due to her consulting relationship with the Creosote Wells operation. Marcus won his blue ribbon back. He brought it home and put it with the others on the wall of his office, and then he came to find Celia in the kitchen where she was going over assessment reports at the long table, and he set the ribbon down on top of her papers, and she looked up. "That belongs in the office," she said. "So do you," he said. "I want to show you something." He had cleared a space on the office wall between his collection of fair ribbons and the framed land survey of the North Pasture, and he had hung her soil conservation paper, the published version, framed in simple wood in the center of it. She stood in the doorway of the office and looked at it. "Marcus," she said, "this operation runs the way it does because of you," he said. "The rotation schedule, the nutrient management, the bull program. Your work is in this land. It belongs on this wall." She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at both of their contributions side by side on the wall, his ribbons and her paper, her science and his earth, and felt the completeness of it. "We're a good operation," she said. "The best in the county," he said. "That's debatable," she said. "Comfortably debatable in our favor," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Outside, the summer afternoon was enormous and golden over the plains, and the Hereford cattle were moving in the south pasture with the slow, content movement of well-managed animals, and the wheat in the north field was high and green, and turning toward gold at the top. By December of 1884, Celia knew she was carrying their child. She told Marcus on a Sunday morning over coffee, in the direct manner she brought to the communication of significant information, and watched his face go through something that took approximately 4 seconds and left him looking like a man who has seen something that changes the way everything else looks. He set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Celia," he said. "March," she said. "Give or take a month." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he held with a gentleness that was different from his usual touch, careful in a new way, as if something had become more precious, and he was adjusting accordingly. "Are you well?" he said. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "Senora Vargas already knows, incidentally. I cannot explain how, but she does." Marcus made a sound that was laughter. "She always knows everything." "She brought me ginger tea this morning before I said anything," Celia confirmed. The pregnancy proceeded with the brisk efficiency that Celia seemed to bring to most biological processes, which is to say that she was sick for 6 weeks, and then completely fine and continued her assessment work, until February with modifications she and Dr. Waverly agreed upon, and drove less and rode in the wagon more, and argued with Marcus regularly about how much she was permitted to do, arguments which he usually lost because she was almost always medically accurate about her own capacity. Their son was born in early April of 1885, 3 weeks late, which Celia said was his father's sense of timing and Marcus said was his mother's thoroughness applied to gestation. They named him Thomas, after Celia's father. Thomas Wells arrived in the world with Marcus's dark eyes and Celia's stubborn determination, and an opinion about sleeping schedules that he expressed loudly and consistently from his first night, a trait that Senora Vargas said she had expected, and which both parents found exhausting and impossible to be genuinely upset about. He was, in the particular way of first children, both entirely himself and recognizably both of them, which Celia found fascinating and documented in a small personal journal that was less scientific observation, and more something she wrote for him to read someday, and which she kept on the table beside her bed. The years that followed built themselves around the ranch, and the work, and Thomas, and eventually, 3 years after Thomas arrived, a daughter they named Ellen after Celia's friend Margaret had recently lost a child, and they wanted to give the name life again. Ellen with her father's stillness and her mother's gray-green eyes, who by the time she was 4 had already demonstrated an aptitude for identifying weak animals in the herd that made Marcus look at Celia with an expression of pure, helpless wonder. "She got it from me," Celia said. "She got everything good from you," Marcus said. "She got her stubbornness from you," Celia said. "That's a fair assessment," Marcus conceded. The ranch grew. The consulting work expanded. Celia eventually formalized her private practice alongside the county position, and her reputation in Texas agricultural circles became one of genuine authority, the kind that is built observation by observation and paper by paper and decision by decision, until it is simply the established fact of what a person is. She addressed 3 more conferences. She was consulted by the Texas Department of Agriculture on a soil management initiative in 1888, and the trip to Austin that year included Marcus and both children, Thomas, now 3 years old, and Ellen, an infant. And the family occupied a corner of the state dining room at the event dinner, with a solidity that Celia found she was no longer analyzing but simply inhabiting. Marcus's reputation as a rancher deepened with time in the way that genuine excellence does, quietly, without announcement, becoming simply what is expected. The Hereford program at Creosote Wells became the standard against which other county operations were measured. He won first place at the fair with some regularity, and lost occasionally to operations that genuinely deserved it. And in either case, he received the result with the same fairness and directness that had characterized him at the 1883 fair, when Celia had handed him the most precise and useful loss of his life. He never forgot what it had cost him in pride that day, and he never stopped being grateful for it. And he told her so on their 5th anniversary, sitting on the porch of the main house in the evening with the plains going dark around them and the children in bed, and the particular quiet that comes when a day has been full and good. "You should know," he said, "that I think about that day at the fair more often than is probably reasonable." "What about it?" she said. "That you sat at that table and you knew you were right and you knew it was going to cause trouble and you did it anyway," he said. "And you did it because it was true and because Red King needed it, not because of anything else." "It was my job," she said. "It was more than your job," he said. "It was who you are, and who you are is," he stopped. "Is," she said. "The most precise and useful thing that ever happened to me," he said. She looked at him in the evening dark, with the stars coming out above them in their vast Texas quantity, and felt the specific thing that she had written about in her notebook on that January night in her office at the Frontier House, terrified, and then underneath it, good. "You are also," she said, "the most precise and useful thing that ever happened to me, for the record." "For the record," he agreed. "A second son came in 1890 and they named him James." He had Celia's gold hair and Marcus's stillness, and at 6 weeks old slept through the night with a composure that Marcus said was a personal insult to the amount of walking he had done with Thomas in his first year. By 1892, Creosote Wells Ranch was 5,000 acres. The east expansion had been completed the previous year, a careful purchase of a neighboring property from a family relocating to California, negotiated by Marcus with the same scrupulous fairness he brought to all of his land dealings. Celia had assessed the property as part of the acquisition process, at Marcus's request and with a careful recusal from the formal county assessment, and had determined that the soil quality on the east section was exceptional for winter wheat cultivation, a determination that proved correct by the 3rd harvest year. They were in the wheat fields one October afternoon, the 3 of them, Celia and Marcus and Thomas, now 7, who had accompanied them on what he considered an adventure, and Celia considered an educational opportunity, and Marcus considered both, when Thomas, who had been walking the field row with his mother's specific quality of paying very close attention to things, stopped and pointed at a stand of wheat and said, "That one's wrong." Celia crouched down beside him and looked at where he was pointing. The wheat in that section showed a barely perceptible difference in the color of the lower stem, a greenish tinge that was the early indicator of a fungal issue she had been watching for since reading a report from the eastern counties. "You're right," she said. Thomas looked at his father. "Is that bad?" "Not if it's caught early," Marcus said, looking at Celia. "We'll treat this section Friday," Celia said to Marcus. "It hasn't spread yet." "How do you know which one was wrong?" Marcus said to Thomas. Thomas thought about this with the seriousness of someone who has spent 7 years absorbing his mother's approach to thinking about things. "It looked different," he said. "I don't know how else to say it." "That's exactly how to say it," Celia said. She stood and took Marcus's hand on one side and Thomas's hand on the other, and they walked back toward the wagon through the October wheat fields while the afternoon light made everything gold. Ellen was in the wagon with Senora Vargas, having declared the field walk boring approximately 20 minutes in, which was her prerogative, and, Celia suspected, a declaration that would last exactly until the day she changed her mind and became as interested in the wheat as her brother. The 1892 Harding County Fair was the 10th anniversary of Celia's arrival in the county. The organizing committee had taken note of this and had placed a small citation in the program, acknowledging her decade of contribution to the county's agricultural assessment and development, which had produced, as the program's text noted, a measurable improvement in the county's documented soil management practices and a significant increase in successful crop yield forecasting across the assessed operations. Marcus read this citation, sitting beside her at the opening ceremony, and said nothing, but his hand found hers under the table and stayed there. Red King III had long since retired from active breeding, being of an advanced age for a prize bull, and his progeny occupied 3 stalls in the Harding County Fair livestock barn, with a collective magnificence that reflected both his genetics and the careful management that had kept him healthy through what would otherwise have been a career-ending injury in 1883. "He should get a citation too," Marcus said, looking at the display. "His children are his citation," Celia said. "Is that a philosophy applicable to people?" he said. She looked at him sideways. "I think we're managing that one adequately." He looked across the fairground to where Thomas was attempting to explain to Ellen with considerable 7-year-old authority why she should be interested in the livestock display, and Ellen was listening with the expression of someone filing information for future use. "Yes," he said, "I think we are." They sat in the afternoon sun while the fair moved around them. The children's competitions and the pie judging and the livestock assessments, and the crop displays, and the sounds of a county community at its most communal, complex, alive, and Celia thought about the woman who had driven down from Abilene in a stage coach with 2 leather trunks and a specific brand of quiet confidence. And then she thought about the man who had crossed a fairground in 8 measured strides with a blue ribbon in his hand and demanded to know why. She thought about the fair that had mattered. The one in 1883, not this one. The moment at the table when she had looked up at him and he had looked down at her, and neither of them had known yet what they were beginning, only that it was real and that it was true, and that it required both of them to be exactly who they were without apology or modification. She thought about his hands on the table that day, and the ribbon he had folded and put in his pocket, and the way he had said you were right with a directness that had cost him something, and had given her something she had not known she needed to be given. She thought about all of it, the office visits and the ranch assessments, and the consulting arrangement, and the evenings on the wagon roads, and the first time he had used her name, the dances and the proposal, and the vows she had written, and the paper on the office wall, and the children, and the wheat fields, and the evenings on the porch, and the specific quality of being known. Marcus turned to look at her, as he had a habit of doing when he felt her thinking, and his eyes were as still and as deep as they had been the first day, and as warm as they had been on their wedding morning. "What?" he said. "I was thinking about what you said once," she said. "That the moment you knew was when I was right and I knew it and I didn't apologize for it." "It was," he said. I was thinking, she said, that if you had gotten the first ribbon that year, none of this would have happened. He considered this. If Red King had been healthy, you would have given me the first ribbon, and yes, I might never have asked you anything more than professional questions. So his injury was the beginning of everything, she said. A beginning needs something to work with, Marcus said. The injury was the occasion. You were the reason. She looked at him across the small space of the fair bench, with the county moving around them and the children's voices carrying across the afternoon and the smell of hay and summer in Texas. And she felt the thing that had no precise agricultural term, that had no citation, no formal measurement, no quantifiable unit, but that was as real as soil nitrogen and as sustaining and as fundamental to the way things grew. You are, she said, the most significant data point in every assessment I have ever made. He looked at her for a moment with that warmed expression, and then he said, that is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me. It's accurate, she said. It is both, he said. James, now 2 and in the arms of Senora Vargas nearby, made a declaration in the particular emphatic language of 2-year-olds that apparently required immediate response, and they both turned toward him. And the moment passed into the afternoon, the way good moments do, not ending exactly, but spreading outward into the rest of the day, into the rest of the life that surrounded it. At the end of the fair, as the light was going long and golden over the county, and the families were beginning to pack their things, and the livestock were being led back to their trailers, Thomas came running to where his parents were standing near the main gate, his face bearing the specific expression of significant news. Ellen said the wheat display in the third booth was better than the one that won, he reported, with the breathless urgency of someone transmitting important intelligence. Celia and Marcus looked at each other. Was she right? Marcus said. She pointed at the second-place entry, Thomas said, the one from Mr. Hartley. Hartley's east section, Celia said immediately to Marcus. I saw it, Marcus said. Honestly, I thought so too. The judging was before my formal recusal ended this year, Celia said, meaning she had not been on the panel. Who did the wheat assessment? Dahlin, Marcus said. He's good, but he doesn't read the stem density. They walked back to find Ellen sitting with Senora Vargas eating a piece of dried apple, looking utterly untroubled by having rendered a judgment that contradicted the official fair results. How did you know? Celia asked her. Ellen considered this with the expression of her father processing something. It looked more right, she said. Celia looked at Marcus. He was looking at their daughter with the same expression he had turned on their son in the wheat field 2 years ago, that of a man watching something confirm itself. She's going to be on the judging panel, he said. Not for another 14 years, Celia said. I can wait, he said, which was a sentence she had heard him say once before in a small office above the county clerk's, and which had the same quality. It had always had the complete and settled patience of a man who knew what he was waiting for and was entirely sure it was worth it. Ellen finished her dried apple and held up her arms to her father, and Marcus lifted her without hesitation, settling her against his shoulder with the ease of someone who had been doing this for long enough that it was simply part of how he moved through the world. They drove back to Creosote Wells Ranch in the long September evening, the wagon loaded with the fair's accumulated day and all 4 children, because they had acquired a fourth, a boy named Robert, born the previous year, who slept through everything and was at present asleep in Senora Vargas's considerable and capable arms, and the plains were going orange and violet around them, and the stars were appearing one by one in the early dark. Celia sat beside Marcus on the wagon seat with his arm around her and the reins in his hands and Texas enormous in every direction, and she thought that she had come to this place looking for something real that frightened her, and she had found it in the precise order she had hoped for: frightened first, and then completely, entirely, permanently at home. Marcus, she said. Yes, he said, without looking away from the road. I would give you the same score again, she said, if I had to. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved forward steadily through the evening. I know, he said, That's why I married you." She leaned against his shoulder. He tightened his arm around her. The ranch appeared ahead of them in the growing dark. The limestone house with its deep porch lit from within by warm lamplight, the outbuildings solid against the sky, the south pasture moving with the quiet dark shapes of the Hereford cattle that were Red King's legacy and her diagnosis, and his careful work all compounded into something that fed and sustained and would outlast them both. The horses turned in at the gate as they had been turning in for years, knowing their way by heart. The light from the house came out to meet them. Senora Vargas began waking the children with gentle efficiency. Thomas climbed down on his own and immediately began telling Ellen something important about the fare that he had been saving, and Ellen listened with her head tilted in the way that meant she was actually listening. And Robert was transferred from Senora Vargas's arms to the house with the smooth logistics of a household that knew its own routines. Marcus helped Celia down from the wagon seat, his hands at her waist, and she stood in the yard for a moment looking at everything that was theirs. "Come inside," he said. "In a moment," she said. She stood there one more minute in the dark Texas evening, looking at the stars that she had never gotten used to and did not want to get used to, those great, low, brilliant Texas stars that hung above the plains like the most extravagant form of accuracy she had ever encountered. She thought about the moment at the fair, now nearly a decade behind her, when she had drawn a line through a name and changed the direction of 2 lives. She thought about Reginald Pratt's eyebrows. She thought about the ribbon folded and pocketed. She thought about 8 measured strides across a fair ground. She thought about the first time her name had sounded like something he had been holding in his mouth carefully. She thought about the precise and useful and terrifying fact of being completely known by someone who was worth being known by. Then she went inside, into the warmth and light of the house they had built together, where her children were being fed and her husband was hanging up his coat, and where the work of tomorrow was already waiting with all of its interesting difficulties and necessary accuracies, and the deep, sustaining, irreplaceable satisfaction of a life lived with complete and honest attention. The door closed behind her. The stars continued above the plains. The ranch rested into the night. And everything was, precisely and without apology, exactly as it should be.